Welcome, everybody, to this week's edition of Inside the GM Studio, a podcast all about the tabletop RPG. Whoa, hold on. The tabletop RPG hobby. I'm your host, Matt.
And I'm David.
This week, my buddy Dan, who was a part of the Thursday group that just recently disbanded, he actually threw me out a question the other day when we were kind of chatting it up a little bit. Dan has never been a fan of medieval fantasy systems. He's not a big fan of D&D. He's not a big fan of Pathfinder, anything like that. He's always been the Call of Cthulhu, Blades in the Dark style. And he's just like, man, I don't know why medieval fantasy is the number one like setting for tabletop RPGs. And I thought that was a good idea. And I was like, that's kind of a cool topic. He's like, yeah, you still do that little podcast thing you do? I was like, yeah, we still do that little podcast thing we do. I was like, yeah, you should talk about that. That'd be a good idea. Like, thanks, Dan. Thanks for you're listening, right? Like, I don't have time for that shit. I was like, oh, all right, cool. Well, thanks for giving us a topic anyway, Dan.
Yeah. Bullshit. Listen, and then you can fucking critique, or at least listen to this episode.
Yeah, fuck it for real, dude. So I threw it at Dave, and I was like, why do you think that medieval fantasy is like the go-to genre, go-to setting for whenever tabletop RPGs come out? Even to date now, I think, with Kickstarters and new games that are coming out, indie games even, it seems like they're like staple setting, and just like the first order is, you want to do medieval fantasy? This is how it's going to be. And then they'll put out usually splat books or like, some add-ons later for other settings. But I wanted to know, why do you think this is, David? Why do you think that one's like the go-to?
Well, it's simple, really. It's the best. See you guys next week.
Oh, man, I wish I knew you were going to do that. I would have had the ending music queued up, just hit it right there. Like, yep, see you guys. Thank you.
No, I've been thinking about this for, the better part of the week, and I have drilled down into a few, well, I wouldn't call it drilling down. I've established a few pillar things. I don't know that they're in any particular order or any of them has any more weight than the others, but for what it's worth, we can kind of just go through them.
Mm-hmm.
The first of which is likely that it was just first to the fence. That counts for a lot, like it's first to the fence. It was the first RPGs were medieval fantasy. So that just kind of bakes into the game, the style of game, as being inextricably tied to a certain genre. And probably the other reasons that I have are probably at least somewhat why D&D and other chainmail and stuff like that were medieval fantasy initially, because the system and the whole style of game lends itself a little bit better to that genre. And so there's other things like why are so many, probably not all, and probably maybe not even a lion's share at this point, but why do so many like tabletop strategy games have to do with like the Napoleon era of history, the Second World War? Like, if you just took those two, like Second World War, Napoleonic, like kind of, Risk and Stratego and Axis and Allies, it's like, well, yeah, they've just kind of become synonymous with that style of game now. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of tactical, strategic medieval games or Renaissance games, but I'd be hard pressed to really name more than a few of them right off the top of my head, and I'm pretty well versed in tabletop board games. This is where everybody in the comments tells me how many there are and how stupid I am, and then says, "You're not well versed if you don't know these 46 games."
You dumb
But
bastard.
I am a dumb bastard. So I don't know, like, what do you think about that as like the first kind of idea, Matt? Like that it just kind of got there first, and so they just kind of go, we set the rules, we set the genre, and here's kind of the formula for something. It's to me, it reminds me a lot of like, um, have you ever asked yourself why so many 7-Elevens are run by Middle Eastern people, why so many nail salons and laundromats are run by Korean, Vietnamese people, why so many
Hmm.
Greeks own bakeries? Like, well, it's because the first immigrants that came here, a lot of them did these things and they were successful. So then a second wave of immigrants comes and they go, okay, I'm Vietnamese and I want to make it here in America. I'm Korean, I'm Middle Eastern, I'm whatever. I want to make it in America as an entrepreneur. Who are the people in my community? Well, there's this guy over here, and there's this guy over here, and this Indian guy over here has a convenience store, and I'm Indian, and I know 8 other guys that are Indians that run 7-Elevens or whatever, and like they seem to be doing all right, and so I can get a lot of advice from them, and the template has been set for them. They've come to this country, and so they just kind of replicate what's been successful already.
Hmm.
And so I suspect something similar is kind of going on with role playing games, but maybe you have more thoughts on that.
I agree with you just because it was like the first one out when Chainmail came out or D&D, the white box and all that came out. It was like, oh, well, this is just the staple. This is how it's done because this is what is out there now. But I also think it's because of how I don't want to say it's easy, but it is. The blueprint for creating adventures are easier for medieval fantasy than anything else, I think. The
Yeah.
hero's journey itself you can use in anything, Star Wars being the perfect thing, that's sci-fi, but it's still fantasy.
Star Wars
But
is not sci-fi. Star Wars is fantasy.
yeah, according to one of our teachers from high school, Star Wars is a fantasy movie, it's not a sci-fi movie.
I wholeheartedly agree with this assessment.
Mm,
Dune as well. While we're at it,
yeah,
like, but anyway, go on.
exactly. And I believe that is one of the other reasons why it is such a like staple is the hero's journey as well as medieval fantasy and everything that has to do with it because of transportation through it is usually very fantastical and it becomes this grand thing and it's usually longer than anything else uh instead of even if you want to do western but like western isn't exciting.
Mm.
Westerns can be exciting if you do like a weird west thing, but when it comes to like big scary monsters and heroes with swords and bows, that's just more exciting. It makes the game feel a little bit more just impactful, I guess I would say. And because not everybody is narratively focused, like the majority of people out there I still say are more combat focused than anything else, and medieval fantasy really is the best for that. If you want good combat, then medieval fantasy are the games that you want. uh like with cyberpunk games now and some of the newer kind of adventure horror games, those are a lot more narrative focused and they got to be a lot more technical, so you got to throw in a little bit more. I believe that medieval fantasy, I don't want to call, yeah, I do, I am going to call it, it's subdued a lot more. There's not as much nuance or as much information as you need in medieval fantasy, and then a lot of other like mystery, horror, a lot of some of the other hippie games coming out now. And I think that's another big boon for them is that you don't have to think too much with medieval fantasy. It can be pretty simple stuff to imagine and just work through.
Yeah, I mean that you don't have to imagine too much is kind of what I was getting at. You're first to the fence. It means this territory is well trodden,
Hmm.
right? And so when you're coming up with an adventure. You're coming up with a character archetype. You're coming. There's just like a legacy that goes so far back, and even extends. This segues into my next point. Actually, like not only like you brought up the hero's journey and Joseph Campbell and mythology and all that shit. So not only does it extend back to the origins of like role playing games in general, but those origins were born out of things far, far older.
Hmm.
And this segues into my second point, which is this type of person that is likely to come up with a RPG is the type of person from a legacy standpoint that is going to be into medieval fantasy because they likely grew up reading like you're kind of used to be that RPGs were built by people that were kind of nerdy and and if you go back to the origins of Dungeons and Dragons, Chainmail, or the first RPGs, nerdy people were often into Lord of the Rings. They were often into mythology and stuff like this, and they liked those characters and those worlds so much that they wanted to inhabit them.
Hmm.
And so as a result, they built a game where they could just play through that. It wasn't like they were thinking, I want to build an RPG, what genre should I set? It was like the other way around. They were like, I want to pretend that I'm a dwarf with an axe killing people and like have I want to be able to affect the plot of like, my favorite stories and kind of go on these heroic journeys like Theseus and Hercules and Jason and Perseus and all these people. And so you get the larger than life characters in heroic fantasy, medieval fantasy. Um, is rife with that, right? Other genres require characters to be more grounded, to be more centered, and they tend to be more character focused as opposed to kind of archetype focused, right? You're
Hmm.
to this day, like when you play in D&D, you can have a perfectly enjoyable time just going like, all right, I'm the big burly fighter guy. Maybe I have a couple of quirks about me, but really my role is to be big and strong and lift things and break doors and drink mead and yada yada yada. And I'm the kind of sly, like, devil may care bard, and I'm silver tongued. It's like, there's just a lot of concepts that are built in, and the people that are the earliest in the genesis of that, they worked that way. Now I think people decide they want to build an RPG maybe, and then they decide on the genre. This is how you get all this cross pollination of genres. Like Savage Worlds can be pretty much anything. You get all these
Hmm.
more generic systems, but really when you're designing a system, you want it to. And I've been on this jag repeatedly on this show. You want to design a system that fits your genre like a glove, so it feels specific to whatever genre you're playing in. Um, so that would be kind of my second pillar point. I don't know if you have anything to add on to that.
No, not onto that one. That one was actually very good. The only thing else that I could think of to add on is like you were saying, when you're a kid, the first couple books that really kept catch your imagination were something like that. Well, at least for us, it was Lord of the Rings, Conan.
Hmm.
Even when we were reading comic books back then, it was the
Yeah.
same thing like that. Uh, so when you're thinking of imagination and you're thinking of the games that bring that sort of joy, you think of those childhood memories. I'm thinking of reading those books. So that was the other thing that I could think of, because when you were first starting off and you were thinking back in the day, or hell, even He-Man,
Hmm.
uh, they were thinking, what kind of role would you want to take, even if you were older? Just think back to a kid of having fun and be like, oh yeah, I do want to live in the world of Conan, of He-Man, and medieval fantasy, of course, just kind of reaches out and grabs you there. You're not going to go out there and be like, oh, I want to be a shadow runner, murking motherfuckers to make some extra cash.
Yeah, it's by the way, not sure if you saw, but I think they're doing a reboot of another Masters of the Universe movie. Just saw the
Yep,
trailer for
I just saw the
uh
trailer the other day.
yeah, I'm skeptical it's going to be any good, but hey, they're doing it.
It's got
Um
some good fan service in it. Fisto, man, they got Fisto in it. That's all I care. I'm happy that they got Fisto.
um yeah, so it's just firstly, first to the fence. Secondly, the type of person that makes an RPG is already going to be the type of person. It's just like you could even more broadly say, why are most why are there so many strategy games, right? Like board games.
Hmm.
Like why are they they're so strategy forward, right? I mean, sure, the European kind of cooperative style of board games have been increasing, and but serious board gamers like strategy games, right? It's all like, why do so many people that are kind of smarty pants why do they play chess? It's like, well, because it's a great vehicle for, testing your metal, right? Or why do people of a certain you could just apply this across the board to anything. If you've known anybody that's played a certain sport, you know certain things about what type of person they are that plays that sport, right? Or the type of person that reads certain books or certain comics or likes certain movies or whatever. Like, why are all the why is it if I meet like a fat lonely incel, the likelihood that he's going to be into anime is like astronomically higher than if he's like a, six pack abs at the gym kind of guy with a chiseled jaw. Like that guy's not watching anime, right?
Hmm.
Like certain types of people do certain types of things, and medieval fantasy appeals to people that like RPGs, and so that's where the market is. That's where the creators are. And it's way, way, way more than it used to be. Like if you just went even back to when I was young, I mean, you had VTM. Yeah, I guess you did have Shadowrun back then, but there wasn't as many offshoot games. Like it was more or less like medieval fantasy with like a
Yeah.
smattering of other
Yeah. You
games.
had Pathfinder, D&D, GURPS, which were all
Yeah,
medieval fantasy. GURPS tried. They were just like, you can play anything. It's a generic universal role playing system. But it was just like, yeah, we just play medieval fantasy.
yeah. It's yeah, I guess there was Rifts and a few others, but it was like pretty much if you
Rifts
played
is
an R
still, I think, more medieval fantasy than it is sci-fi.
yeah, it's a smattering of things.
Mm.
Anyway, so there's also some things too that are less general than this that was trying to think on. One of them is I think medieval fantasy is conducive to role-playing games in a variety of ways. And I guess I'll maybe you could break these out into different reasons, but they kind of all fall under that umbrella. Like a medieval fantasy role-playing game is conducive to um, the sort of dynamic a role playing game is fertile ground for. One, it's typically plot focused,
Hmm.
right? Other genres, right, like cyberpunk, for instance, it can be somewhat action oriented, but because that genre has more roots in cinema than it does in like literature, for instance, it tends to be more kind of atmospheric,
Hmm.
high concept, and somewhat character driven. These things don't lend themselves to plot based quests with characters have a lot of agency to do a lot of variety of different things that are kind of more sandboxy. Um, as much as I love, like for instance, Blade Runner, pretty much any of the works of Philip K. Dick, um, I just I don't know that it like lends itself to like a particular style. It either has to be like a detective story if you're going to play a Blade Runner game,
Hmm.
and that very much narrows some of the things that can be done, and also it doesn't follow along beat by beat. So you'd have to set it up more like a film where it's like certain scenes, and if there's not like lots of dynamic drama, right? It's mostly like, dialogue and characters are kind of exploring options and they're exploring ideas because of the world. The world is the thing that changes the characters in the world. It's not the characters changing the world, which is
Hmm.
what medieval
Oh,
fantasy
that's,
is,
yeah. I didn't even
right?
think about
So
that one. That's a good one.
so they're affecting their environment more than the
Hmm.
environment is affecting them, right? In a horror game, in a cyberpunk game, and pretty much any kind of like sci-fi game is a little more like that, like a sci-fi game as opposed to like a cyberpunk game.
Hmm.
Um, can probably be a little more quest based, right? But I'll say that there are some other elements um, to medieval fantasy that lend itself more toward an RPG. And one of them is the kind of concept of the world and the set pieces, right? Like exploring forgotten dungeons lend themselves neatly to kind of uh, quest-based things. You're going into an unknown thing. The world is old, and there's these ruins and these structures that used to be inhabited, dead civilizations, and so forth. And you foray into them for adventure. Now, in a world that's largely inhabited, like VTM has this problem. VTM has to be set up in kind of scenes, and they can't really be they tend not to be super they tend to be linear, right? They're almost like scripted out in a variety of different ways, but it doesn't lend itself to set pieces and to foraying into the unknown as much as like a medieval fantasy game does, because there's kind of bright spots of civilization, but the world is mostly uninhabited. And
Hmm.
so that means there is kind of this frontier, which a genre like Weird West or something would also have. Um, and so it would kind of hit that beat pretty nicely. But here's another thing that I think kind of doesn't why the Weird West one isn't as satisfying as and sci-fi, even though they might be plot driven and lend themselves to kind of quest based. It's the introduction of technology. So the more technology you have, the more the characters can use it to kind of get out of a scrape. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but a character with just a sword and his wits is like, again, is affecting the plot in a much more direct way. If you have laser guns and spaceships and stuff, this feels like it's not as heroic in a classical sense of the
Hmm.
hero's journey kind of way, where the characters are using their wits and their strength and their moxie to kind of get out of scrapes, and they have to do so in an up close and intimate way, right? If you have a Barrett 50 cal that can shoot a hole in you fucking through a building a mile away, that kind of removes, and you have to think in terms of like what makes those dynamics interesting. And again, going back to my very first point, because everything is so well trodden in heroic fantasy, medieval fantasy, you don't really have to go, what are the unique benefits of this style of game, right? Like you're playing a sci-fi game, and you better leverage the technology is very important, but the more important that technology is, then it makes the characters less important, and ergo it's less heroic. That's why
Hmm.
sci-fi films often they don't they're exploring concepts through the what if scenario of a technology, but they might have a human touch and a human element to them, but they don't lend themselves to the character doing grand deeds. So I feel like I had another subset, but I'll let you jump in here if
Yeah,
you have any
I
thoughts.
I want to go on about how you talked about how you're able to like change the world around you through your
Hmm.
deeds in medieval fantasy, and it made me think about it. It was like, yeah, oh yeah, 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 yeah. This is good keeping it terrestrial though, because
Hmm.
like you said, if you're doing modern or even neo cyberpunk style, which is a bit futuristic, that's too real. Like even if you're doing cyberpunk and modern, that's too real now. You know what's going on. There's not much that really changes around you.
Yep.
It's something that you're familiar with. If you go too far in the future and you go that sci-fi route, then it becomes too enclosed or it's too large. Going through the
It's
universe, going to other planets, it becomes so large that
it
it becomes hard to start to fathom.
Yes, not just that though, but that kind of reminded me of another point I wanted to make. So it's not just that it's too much to fathom. That is part of it.
Mm.
But it's also that there's a reason that games like Shadowrun and other pseudo sci-fi based games have so much fucking lore in them, is
Hmm.
because the more advanced the world is, the more everything is kind of like painted out, right?
Yep.
In a medieval fantasy, where the characters probably grew up in some rural village, it's perfectly plausible and acceptable that the characters wouldn't have much knowledge of the world beyond where right what their immediate thing is. But when you start introducing like, you know, vehicles, and you start introducing like telephones, and you start introducing like these abilities to like connect the world, then it becomes less plausible that the characters themselves wouldn't have knowledge of the world at large. And that scale of world building can be very arduous and distract from your central plot, which is initially supposed to be kind of an escalating plot. You know, a lot of sci-fi starts off with bigger stakes, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
escalate the stakes, right? It starts off with like, oh, replicants are real and they're basically slaves and some of them escaped in this off-world colony and you're like, okay, that's automatically like a pretty big scope idea. Now the portrayal of it, for those of you that don't know, that's the plot of Blade Runner. um, the scope of it comes back down to ground and it becomes this detective story. But you need to like the stakes of what is in play, which is like the nature of what it means to be a human. They don't escalate. They start there, right? And that's part of the appeal of those genres. Same thing with cosmic horror, right? It starts with like world-ending damnation, like
Hmm.
it's just boilerplate stakes, and then you go to it. But what they don't do is ramp up as um, medieval fantasy starts low stakes or starts small scope, and then the scope widens the aperture with each revelation in the plot, right? And so maybe the impetus for it is we're going to save the world eventually, and but typically it's kind of like you're peeling an onion and the aperture is widening and so there's this like escalation where you're like climbing a ladder which, in the plot, which is mirrors the characters climbing the ladder of levels. And so there's this nice symmetry to heroic medieval fantasy that kind of mirrors the structure of what it does best.
It does, but it's also so malleable that it's so familiar for people when you think about it, because everybody knows what a castle looks like. They know what a medieval village looks like. Whenever it's described, you got that feeling. Uh, but like you said, when it changes, it also feels familiar and like it's supposed to. It's like it's something that just happens. It
Yeah.
progresses and it changes through your own actions that your characters take, and it feels right. I guess I should say, like, yeah, that's what is supposed to happen. It's not
It
supposed to become stagnant, and this it changes because of the things that I do because of my heroic actions.
Yeah, and you can throw a skin over it, and this is why I'm always so disappointed when people say that sci-fi, or that Star Wars is sci-fi, or that Dune is sci-fi,
Mm.
because it's like, look, you've thrown the trappings of a sci-fi genre over the top of those. There are spaceships, and there are, droids, and but these are just trappings. Science fiction, in a more traditional sense of the word, in a Ray Bradbury, Philip K. Dick, Ursula Le Guin kind of way, is like the technology is integral to the plot, right? Like if you remove whatever science is in the science fiction, if you remove it, it destroys the plot, right? Like if you take away the precogs in Minority Report, right? There is no such thing as people that can see into the future, and they turn this into a technology where they use it to fight crime. If you remove that technology, there is no plot to the film, right?
Right.
None. And so, but like Star Wars, for instance, is like, sure, there are spaceships and shit, but I mean, you have princesses and you have a giant base, which
Yeah.
more or less might as well just be a castle, and there's laser swords and
Well,
they're
yeah.
fighting with swords.
There's knights sword fighting.
Yeah, there's knight sword fighting, there's a wizards,
Yeah.
there's like, okay, so same thing with Dune. It's like this is intergalactic fantasy. You call
Hmm.
it space opera or whatever you want, but there's no technology in there that you couldn't remove, especially because most of it's not even explained what it is or how it does anything, and none of it really looks very sciency, right? The dogfights and Star Wars are like they're more like fighter pilots here on Earth fighting in
Yeah.
space. It's not like what 2001: A Space Odyssey is what ships in space looks like. Boring and silent and plodding with tens of thousands of miles between them, and they're firing. Battlestar Galactica, that's a better
Yeah.
example.
There you go.
Um, so these things, like when you even just layer the skin of them over it, this is the reason I suspect that Star Wars has such popularity, or I should say, had such popularity. I don't think it so much does anymore, but it's like you go, okay, let's take all the elements of fantasy, the hero's journey, the this, that, and the other, the vague things that are kind of like magic, but then like let's give it a cool polish with some, we're not gonna have horses, but people will have speeders and shit, and that'll be cool. It'll look technological, and then there'll be like, these guys in armor, and they'll be robots, but they'll basically just be like minions, but they're not orcs, but they're robots, and that's cool, and then it's like you get both people that like both of those things. It scratches both of the itches. But scope is a big thing, and when you introduce an intergalactic scope, it is difficult to render in a game. This is, I suspect, the reason that have so much trouble with Star Wars RPGs, because it's like got an intergalactic scope, like a big sci-fi thing,
Hmm.
but it's still got all the trappings of fantasy. So you're like, how do I have this feel intimate and small scale? And then like, but then also have the characters like flitting around from one planet to another, and it's like there's no way to do it when you don't have cuts and you don't have like scenes where the audience sees something, because
Uh-huh.
in order to contextualize something that big, you need the audience needs to see something that the characters in the narrative don't, right? You cut to Darth Vader talking to the Emperor. This gives you exposition. You know what's happening. You know that things are scheming against the characters. Because of the POV of a tabletop RPG is character centric, like you can't give them this extraneous cinematic information that's beyond their scope of perception, or at the very least, you have to do it very limitedly. And what this does is it pulls the narrative in and gives it blinders, and that doesn't work for something that's too big of a scope. And if you're pulling out so much that you need that, then it's just like it would be like having a movie, and every if every Star Wars movie, or if every scene in Star Wars had to have Luke Skywalker in it so that he knew what, like, that would really hamstring the plot. You would be like, man, that's really, really difficult to like tell the same story but have Luke in every damn scene. It's like, well, something's happening halfway across the galaxy, man. Like, like how do I get him there in a reasonable way without like breaking the plot where he's jumping around from planet to planet in every scene? It just doesn't work. And so, but if the stakes and the immediacy of the dramaturgy, or whatever you want to call it, is immediate and in front of the characters because they're exploring unknown and they're peeling that onion, then it feels more organic.
All right. I think that's going to bring us to the end of this episode. I don't think we have much else to go on. I think we've hit all the points that need to be said about this. Unless you
No,
got
I
anything
got
to
I got
finish on.
I got 5 more points.
I was going to say you
No,
still got about
no,
another
that's
45 minutes, David, that I know you could go on if you have anything.
no. Those were the main things. I think that when you and they're all kind of they're all somewhat interconnected, right? But when you
Mm,
put them all together in this kit and caboodle, it lends itself neatly to not having to reinvent the wheel to have an RPG. Um, Especially if you want to have an RPG that has this, for lack of the better word, the same energy as a medieval fantasy. Like, look, I think it's pretty easy to kind of like throw all that out the window if you want to have like what we would call a cozy game or a hippie game,
mm,
right? It's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to throw all that toolkit out the door. But if you want to have the same dynamism and the same energy that a medieval fantasy thing has, it's like you kind of have to, okay, you drill down into what are the strengths of each genre, what does it do well, how would I incorporate them into a game, and then suddenly it's like, man, now you're talking about like things that expert storytellers do. They and that's kind of hard to do as somebody that's like just considering a game or trying to build a mechanic system, and that it might be a tall order for most people.
mhm. All right. Well, that's going to bring us to the end of this episode. What about you out there? What do you think? Are you even fans of medieval fantasy? You think it's shit? You think it's not even worth it? You're wrong, but why? Why do you believe this? Let us know. Send it to insidethegmstudio@gmail.com. Or you can always come over Hold on, I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. Why did I pause that long? Come over to twitch.tv/Inside the GM Studio. We usually do this live every Sunday at 9 p.m. Eastern. We can come in and talk in the chat. I was just seeing our old friend Spars is in there listening to us. What's up, Spars? You can come in, check it out. But for this week, for Inside the GM Studio, I've been your host, Matt.
And I'm David.